Just like you saw in my previous video, understanding the perspective grid, the first step to create a two-point perspective grid is to put two vanishing points on the horizon line. Just as explained before regarding the one-point perspective grid, the two-point perspective grid involves the depth, width, and height dimensions, but the depth and width dimensions both have vanishing points, while the vertical lines representing height don't. It is important to note that lines on a perspective grid don't have to be equally spaced. They are simply markers that are being used as guides for the directional lines of the objects in the image, but they are still subordinate to the original dimensions of these objects. For the sake of this example, we have placed those 2 points inside the page on the horizon line, which creates a little bit of distortion on the final boxes. In our situation, that is not a big problem. But if you want to create shapes that look more accurate, it is better to put one of these points a little further outside the page, so your shapes have less chance to get distorted. Distortion in a perspective grid happens when these two vanishing points are either too far apart from each other or too close, similarly to what you can see in a 3D software. There are ways to calculate precisely square-cornered shapes on a perspective grid, but in most cases, and as long as you're not working on ultra-precise architecture, it is faster to approximate the angle and get the right feel for it. A lot of what we eventually learn in perspective drawing and structure has to do more with what feels or looks right, rather than being absolutely perfect, especially when it comes to storytelling composition, which is a subject matter I will talk about in another video. It is important to understand that a two-point perspective situation works for a series of buildings, boxes, or objects all arranged in the same direction. Any of these objects pointing in an even slightly different direction would need a different set of vanishing points, depending on the new direction that object is pointing towards. Setting up your perspective grid for simple buildings usually doesn't present major difficulties. The challenge comes more with dealing with the details. To create windows, doors, arches, and more complex details of architecture in your objects, you can follow a similar procedure as what I explained in the previous one-point perspective video, especially when it comes to circles and ellipses. Find the center or split middle of your surface, using crossing lines if necessary, then proceed to create the circular or semicircular shape. Remain aware of symmetrical issues you might be dealing with, and you should be good to go. Now, once you understand the principle of two-point perspective, it is fairly easy to understand what three-point perspective is. It is simply adding a third vanishing point above or below the horizon line towards which the vertical lines will be converging. If the third vanishing point is above the horizon line, you have an upshot view. If it is below the horizon line, you have a downshot view. In order to help you get better at perspective drawing, you can start with real-life studies or photos in which you first try to identify the horizon line, then the different perspective directional lines of depth, width, and height. Then try to reproduce those lines on your paper surface, construct the main block shapes, and finally work on the details. Now you understand the principles of two- and three-point perspective.